money is the root of all evil. It turned us from gangbangers into full-fledged animals.
The 80s were just insane in Detroit.
Best Friends Gang were the most bloodthirsty crime syndicate the city of Detroit had seen since Prohibition.
Detroit has, by far, the highest murder rate in the nation. About 2 murders a day.
White Boy Rick,
Boogaloo and Rockin' Reg.
Big Ed Hansard,
Maserati Rick.
Demetrius Holloway.
We all grew up together.
Guys doing business on Monday were at each other's throats on Tuesday.
Who gonna call the police?
There were no more off-limit zones.
It was straight out war, bro.
He was in the intensive care unit recovering, and a man walked in, blew his head off.
Nobody cared who nobody was no more.
It never dawned on them that the federal government would be listening.
Every group ends the same way. And that was the end of the Best Friends.
Now, on Gangsters, murder for hire in the Motor City, the Best Friends Gang. Detroit, 1988, the height of the crack era. Gang warfare had plagued the streets of Motown for nearly a decade.
Whether it's drugs, murders, public corruption, it's all there.
The drug game was out of control. It was like millions and millions of dollars being made through the city of Detroit at that time.
It's a battle that's difficult for the police to win because in many places, the crack trade has transformed small-time hoodlums into big-time entrepreneurs.
At the same time, you have a landscape that's dotted with abandoned homes. The city proper was falling apart.
One spot still doing great business was the Top Hat hamburger stand on McClellan and Gratiot.
Top Hats was one of our favorite places to hang out on the weekend. You know, all the homeboys, anybody that's anybody, we would all meet right there sometime and then break and go to the clubs from that point.
Robert Boyd was a kid from the East Side. He was in the game.
I got involved with gangs, drugs, and violence by the time I was 10 years old. On the east side of Detroit, everybody knew everybody because back in them days, everybody wanted a pack. Everybody wanted to sell because it was so much money.
By 1988, the biggest player at the Top Hat was a guy Robert Boyd grew up with. For a while, Demetrius Meech Holloway made more money than anybody.
Demetrius Holloway became the biggest drug kingpin in Detroit in the mid to late 1980s.
He was a guy who loved to dress nice, you know what I mean, and the silk suits and the gaiters and all of that.
He could afford it. At the height of his reign, Holloway was reportedly moving hundreds of kilos of cocaine a month, buying from a Colombian source and selling it to crack dealers all over Detroit.
Meech got full-fledged in the game, man. You know, he made millions of dollars as well.
He was someone that, you know, would kill you in a blink of an eye, but business was his #1 priority.
Cunning, obviously. You have to be cunning to survive in the streets for as long as he did.
Holloway was playing chess while a lot of the other people in the street were playing checkers.
By November 1988, he was known by the government and he was being hunted by his enemies.
The city of Detroit was looking at Demetrius for years, but they couldn't really put anything on him.
This is Demetrius Holloway, drug lord, and they hadn't convicted him of anything.
Well, eventually, the feds came in and took these cases away from Detroit police.
The feds are bearing down on everyone. They're putting together a giant case against Demetrius and Maserati Rick.
Holloway's #2, Richard Carter, known on the street as Maserati Rick, had been assassinated only weeks before. The killing brought national attention to the drug war in Detroit.
Rick got shot over on 6 Mile, and they took him to Sinai Hospital over there on the west side.
Somebody comes into his hospital room and kills him right in the hospital bed.
That's when things got out of hand, man, you know?
Demetrius, without a question, knew that his life was in danger.
Maserati Rick's killing had just put more federal attention on Demetrius Holloway. But his most feared enemies did not wear uniforms and badges.
What could have been Demetrius' downfall happened early on in his reign when he decided to start doing business with the Best Friends gang.
The foundation of the Best Friends gang was a brotherhood. The Brown brothers, Terrence, Reggie, Gregory, and Ezra.
The city had seen gangsters, they'd seen mobsters, they'd seen kingpins, but they never saw the level of complete devotion to kill and litter the street with bodies as they saw with the Best Friends.
Everybody from the East Side was petrified of the Best Friends.
Demetrius Holloway had grown up with the Brown brothers. He knew full well what they were capable of.
He originally just hired them as an enforcement crew. They were muscle, and that's all they were.
Murder for hire. They don't discriminate. They'll work for anybody that's got the money.
But after a while, they decided they wanted a piece of the game, and Demetrius didn't want to give it to them.
They want money, but more than that, they want some respect for what they have done.
Demetrius looked at them as workhorses, guys that he could have go do his bidding for him. He didn't want to cut them in on business. I don't think he had that level of respect for them.
They started doing their thing and got out of control, you know what I'm saying? And they started robbing other drug dealers. Who gonna call the police? The game started falling by the wayside. Nobody cared who nobody was no more. The respect level was gone, put it like that.
The Brown brothers and their gang of best friends struck fear into the heart of East Detroit.
They were these 4 6'3", 240-pound menace to societies.
The leader was the youngest brother, Terrence Brown, a.k.a. Boogaloo.
Terrence Brown wanted to take over all the territory. He wanted to be the exclusive person in Detroit to manage the drug business. Therefore, he had to eliminate his competition.
The second youngest, Reginald, a.k.a. Rockin' Reg, was the group's head enforcer.
Boogaloo was the brains and Rockin' Reg was the brawn. Anyone who got in their way got killed. I mean, point blank.
By 1988, the one man standing in their way of taking over the cocaine and crack business in the city of Detroit was Demetrius Holloway.
Rockin' Reg and Boogaloo started killing anyone in sight that had any remote connection to Demetrius Holloway.
The open war did not come without consequences. The oldest brothers, Gregory, a.k.a. Ghost, and Ezra, a.k.a. Wizard, were gunned down in 1986. Holloway's crew was believed to be behind the shootings.
If there was anything tying the remaining 2 Brown brothers to reality or some semblance of sanity, it ceased to exist after Ghost and Wizard were killed.
And that's when Terrence Brown stepped up, and that's when the murders really took off. He wanted to get revenge for his brother's killings.
Best Friends gang existed for roughly 5 years and killed over 100 people. Those aren't gangsters, those are serial killers. Those are sociopaths.
That's a lot of people killed. Most of them were not on their way to get the Medal of Honor, but they still got killed.
In all the Best Friends bloodshed, they still hadn't gotten to their biggest target, Demetrius Holloway.
He was a businessman gangster, someone who dressed in 3-piece suits instead of tracksuits, someone incredibly adept at maneuvering through different factions of the underworld.
He was everything the Brown brothers were not.
Demetrius was a really smart guy, didn't drink, didn't use drugs. He could have been a CEO of a company. He had leadership qualities.
Demetrius always had an end game in this whole thing, and the Browns never had an end game. The Browns just wanted to kill.
By November 1988, it seemed like Holloway's number was up.
He knows that he's a wanted man by both the best friends, the government, and possibly other forces at play.
So it's the Top Hat hamburger stand on Gratiot in 94, which was the epicenter of the East Side.
4 masked gunmen approached Holloway.
Somebody fires some shots.
He was trying to make business, not waves, but then, you know, he's caught in the typhoon. He had to act accordingly, and that was all guns blazing.
In the chaos of the shootout, Holloway was grabbed.
He was thrown into a trunk and disappeared.
Detroit's biggest drug dealer, Demetrius Holloway, was taken in plain sight, leaving the streets in the hands of Detroit's most violent gang, the Best Friends.
It was straight out war, bro. You know what I mean? Everybody forgot we all grew up together as kids. All that fell by the wayside, man.
January 1980. President Jimmy Carter signs the Chrysler Corporation Loan Guarantee Act, a $1.5 billion federal bailout for the auto industry.
Chrysler is back in the business of selling cars and trucks.
The 1970s had seen a foreign invasion in the marketplace. Americans were buying cars made in Germany, Korea, and Japan.
In the 1980s, there were still people coming up from the South for auto industry jobs that weren't really here.
That summer, Detroit hosted the Republican National Convention and witnessed the nomination of Ronald Reagan.
By 1982, 1/3 of the entire city was receiving financial assistance from the government. The school system was falling apart, and the drug industry moved in as the biggest employer.
This is the world inherited by the Best Friends gang.
I tell people all the time, the game never changed, man, just the players in the game.
A lot of these guys did not grow up in a stereotypical poverty-stricken, poor household. They grew up in working class or middle class households, but as they became 17, 18, 19, 20, the economic opportunities that their parents had weren't there, but there was a new economic opportunity. Standing on the corner, selling drugs, making lots of money.
Demetrius Holloway was raised in the Brewster Projects. Diana Ross came out of the same projects. His mother was a mail carrier for the Postal Service. He actually carried the mail before he went to jail.
Holloway grew up in an area in the East Side where a man named Frank Nitty Usher held sway.
Frank Usher was an individual who was murder for hire. He didn't have any problems executing his duties, if you want to use that word.
Usher was incarcerated in 1979 for a triple beheading, and he sort of mentored Holloway when he was young.
Holloway was busted transporting stolen goods across state lines for Usher and the Murder Row gang. He served 5 years of hard time and was released in 1985.
Demetrius was vouched for by Usher while he was in federal prison. When Holloway got out, he had this connection. He hit the ground running, and intelligence said that he was getting up to 300 kilos of cocaine a month, which is a lot of cocaine. Within 6 months, he's one of the biggest drug dealers in the city.
Fresh out of prison and building the business, he looked back to his roots for a partner in crime.
He brought a childhood friend of his to be his right-hand man, Richard Maserati Rick Carter, who really was an opposite personality to Demetrius.
Rick was real flashy, you know. He was the first cat out the whole clique in Detroit, man, that bought the Canary Yellow Maserati. You know, he had it imported from Germany. I remember the day it came through, you know what I mean? We was over by the projects. He pulled up on me, you dig? You know, I'm like, damn, man. I said, that's tight, bro. And that's when he got named Maserati.
He would go on to become a Mercedes-Benz man, but the name Maserati never left him.
He was a hell of a boxer when he was young.
Rick was kind of a petty criminal. Good-looking guy, loved the nicer things in life. Didn't have a way to get them until Demetrius came along.
A lot of these guys grew up together. So at first, that made for a bond of trust, and it made it easy to make money.
With a steady supply of cocaine, Holloway and Carter went to work.
Demetrius Holloway was a pretty savvy operator. He was a guy who didn't really drink or smoke. His drug of choice was making money and gambling. Holloway was sort of the last of a dying breed.
If you was from Detroit back in the 80s, you know, you was getting that money, man. You was wearing minks, you was wearing gator shoes, you was wearing silk suits, you know? We would all shop at Funky Broadway.
All right, we pulling in the parking lot right now. Just to look at it brings back big memories, how we used to come down here and shop, man, for the nanny goats, the minks and the raccoons and all of that right here, you know?
The Brown brothers were a little bit younger than Demetrius Holloway, but from the same part of town.
The father worked at the factory. The mother was a homemaker.
They were called the best friends because the group of their inner circle had all grown up together as best friends.
They traveled in packs, and they hunted on the streets of Detroit from a very early age.
The best friends started off doing hits when they were teenagers, and they quickly became embroiled in beefs all over the city, because when you kill people, people want to kill you.
Holloway had hired them initially as muscle to help collect drug money and keep the street-level dealers in line.
When he got into business with the Brown brothers, I don't think he could necessarily foresee the lunacy that these guys inhabited.
I don't know what went wrong in their lives, but once they started killing people, they didn't want to stop.
Murder rates shot up in 1986 in almost every major city in the country. Detroit's homicide rate led the nation with 646 killings. This was at the height of the best friend spree.
Detroit has, by far, the highest murder rate in the nation, about 2 murders a day.
They were killing machines. Most people in that world say it's business, it's not personal. Well, they turned that completely on its head. For them, it was always personal, it wasn't business.
They began hiring like-minded people, targeting members for the team.
Nate Kraft was nicknamed Boone for Daniel Boone because of his skill with a knife. He was a guy that grew up on the east side of Detroit, went away to the Army. The Brown brothers scoped him out down at a tough man contest.
Their #1 lieutenant, a man by the name of Stacy Colbert, went by the nickname The Machine, as in the killing machine.
All of these guys were independent operators who worked together at some times and were at odds sometimes. Everyone was in the quest to get a direct Colombian connection or somebody who could feed them with as much drugs as possible.
Best friends got that connection allegedly from an unlikely source. Holloway's childhood friend and partner, Maserati Rick.
According to local street lore, Maserati Rick introduced the Brown brothers to Demetrius's connection, which allowed the Brown brothers to start getting drugs directly.
Once the Brown brothers got that, they didn't need anybody else.
It didn't take long for them to understand the game and see the kind of money their boss was making.
And the Brown brothers realized, why should they be killing people for just part of the drugs when they could just kill all the drug dealers and take over, which is what they started to do.
Rockin' Reg and Boogaloo and them cats didn't have no remorse. Well, it's scary when you got any individual that don't care, you know what I mean? When you're not caring, that means you're willing to do anything.
In 1985, one of the biggest films at the box office in America was the story of a Detroit police officer who leaves the mean streets of the Motor City for a fantasy life in Beverly Hills. Had Beverly Hills Cop been based on a true story, Eddie Murphy would have been running from the Best Friends gang. By 1986, the Brown brothers had struck out on their own. Wizard, Ghost, Rockin' Reg, and Terrence, aka Boogaloo, had moved the Best Friends gang from murder for hire to full-fledged cocaine kingpins. And they were targeting the territory of their former boss, Demetrius Holloway.
They might not have had the business acumen that Demetrius had, but they were catching up quickly.
When people seen them coming, they would get out the way. They had big chains, you know, we all wore big chains back in the day. We had the top hats, dancing in the rain, you know. We had stingy brims, you know what I mean, the big enforcer hats. They was always unpredictable. The next thing you know, it's game over, lights out. That's how their process was working.
That Christmas, that process happened to them. December 20th, 1986, a car pulls up beside the Brown brothers. Shots are fired, and the second oldest Brown, Wizard, is killed.
To be honest with you, Demetrius and the Best Friends, we all grew up together, you know what I mean? Rockin' Reg and Boogaloo and Meech, we all knew everybody, so I want to set that for the record, you know what I mean? But then, you know, everybody started getting out of control. You feel what I'm saying?
The shooter was believed to be connected to Demetrius Holloway.
Holloway wanted to nip the problem in the bud, and in his mind, nipping the problem in the bud was just simply executing the Brown brothers, removing them from this earth.
Hours after the funeral for Wizard, the oldest Brown brother, Ghost, is gunned down by another drive-by shooting. He was still wearing his funeral suit. After
their two brothers, Ghost and Wizard, went down, they kind of felt like, we don't care if we die, we don't care if we go to jail, we're just going to take down as much territory as we can in the time that we're on the streets.
Before the killings of Ghost and Wizard Brown in 1986, Demetrius Holloway and Maserati Rick controlled 75% of the drug trade in East Detroit. After the two Brown brothers were killed, all gangs scrambled for territory. A gangster known as Big Ed Hansard took Jefferson Boulevard. Robert Boyd and the 430 gang were at Warren and Connors. And the Best Friends began at Van Dyke and Harper and looked to take over the entire East Side.
Terrence Brown, aka Boogaloo, when his brother Rockin' Reg exacted their revenge, and a lot of bodies dropped.
While the brothers behind the Best Friends gang were cut in half, business for Demetrius Meech Holloway was also suffering. Word on the street was that Meech was vulnerable.
Big Ed Hansard was a stylish, old-school gangster, very well-dressed. He owned a series of hair salons.
Big Ed had been one of Holloway's biggest customers. Demetrius and Maserati Rick would reportedly front Hansard the cocaine and collect the money after it sold.
From what I heard from Rick himself, you know, that Big Ed had owed him some money, you know what I'm saying, and didn't want to pay up.
Big Ed Hansard certainly could have afforded to pay Maserati Rick any money he may or may not have owed him. Ed, at this point, was going out to California and getting his own 100-kilo loads from the Crips in L.A. that had a Colombian connection.
Big Ed Hansard started moving his own product in Detroit, which didn't sit well with Demetrius and Maserati.
In fact, Big Ed's nickname, Big Ed, supposedly came from Maserati Rick's mother.
He was sleeping with Maserati's mom, and Maserati's mom called him Big Ed.
The running joke turned into deadly gunplay.
Literally, anytime they would see each other, they'd pull out guns and start shooting at each other.
Everybody was turf worn. It was like unreal, you know? I'm like, wow, we all grew up together, you know what I mean? From having fun and making money and shopping and all that to now it's full-fledged war. That's exactly what that money did to all of us as young kids, man. It turned us from gangbangers into full-fledged animals when it came to the hustle world.
You have to remember, all these events we're talking about occurred in the space of a few years, and I'm sure that it was all happening so fast One day they were making a couple $100, and a year later they were multiple murderers and they were counting millions of dollars.
By the spring of 1987, the Best Friends gang was making new enemies as well. The story of white boy Rick Wershey is as legendary as any told in Detroit.
White boy Rick knew Demetrius and he knew Maserati. His father sold guns. He was the only white guy around us coming up back in them days, you know? Nobody cared because he was white, you know what I mean? He was just Rick.
He was this 16-year-old white kid in a 90% black city that was a major drug dealer. He grew up in the same neighborhood with the Brown brothers, and they were friends at first, but Rick's best friend, a guy named Steve Roussel, became involved in a dispute with Rockin' Reg over a girl. The Brown brothers told Rick that he was gonna have to choose between Steve and them, and he chose to be friends with Steve.
Petty little disputes would erupt into murder. It had nothing to do with business, it had nothing to do with drugs, it had nothing to do with anything other than the fact that Freaky Steve was dating a girl that Rockin' Reg used to date.
Freaky Steve Roussel was killed as he slept by Reggie Brown.
He busted in the door with an Uzi and blew him away on the couch while he was sleeping.
A relative of Roussel's was at the apartment. He was wounded but survived and testified against Reggie Brown.
Reggie was found and arrested.
Brown was convicted of murder and put away for life, but it wouldn't stick.
Next thing you know, look at the news and boom, something done happened again, you know? For some reason, Rockin' Reg got out.
Rockin' Reg ends up just rampaging on a death spree.
September 1987. Rockin' Reggie Brown, one of the last two remaining Brown brothers, the heart and soul of the Best Friends gang, ambushed a rival and killed him while he slept. Brown would be convicted of second-degree murder in the shooting death of Steve Roussel.
Rockin' Reg ended up with life sentence behind it.
But then he got an appeal bond and was let out of prison, which is something that never happens.
He was released within a year after a state judge ordered a new trial in the case.
The rules got broke when the money got major. You know, once the money got major, all rules went out the game.
By that time, the Best Friends, as well as their childhood pals, Demetrius Holloway and Maserati Rick Carter, had made millions of dollars selling kilos of cocaine to crack dealers throughout Detroit.
Money is the root of all evil. They become addictive, bruh. Just like the dope fiend addicted to the dope. And you get a rush when you can get $1 million or 100,000 or whatever. That's a rush, you know what I mean?
Demetrius had this spot over here on right here on Mack and Gray. He had spots all around the city, but right here was a gold mine, right here on Mack and Gray, you know? Right now, we're on the east side of Detroit in Parkside Projects. Well, me and my cousin Daryl controlled this right here. We used to have $12 packs, you know what I'm saying? And $10 came to the team and $2 went to the runner. Millions of dollars made, man, you know?
Started changing around 87. That's when the Best Friends started getting on the Fed's radar and all kind of things started happening.
I was asked to supervise and prosecute cases resulting from undercover operation conducted by the Detroit Police Department and ATF. Because of our success in this undercover project, DEA decided to join. At that point, we decided to go after large-scale drug operations, and the first one I was involved with was the Hansard case.
A kilo distributor known as Big Ed Hansard had been in a turf war with Demetrius Holloway and Maserati Rick Carter in 1987. The following year, the beef turned bloody and erupted into national news.
They were trying to shoot each other, and Maserati owned a car wash up on 7 Mile, and Big Ed showed up one day and shot him.
It's right there, you know, it's still there. Everybody was their own man, you know. Big Ed was his own man, Maserati was his own man. It brings back very, very bad memories, and it brings back memories that can't nobody ever erase from their mind or their heart, you know. A lot went on here.
When he got shot in the stomach, man, that's just wild. You know, the whole hood was like, man, you know, it's out of hand now.
Rick was rushed to a local hospital and underwent hours of surgery to save his life.
Now, at this time, the news media was really mesmerized with all these almost Shakespearean characters, and this stuff is on the news. So it's on the news that Detroit drug dealer Maserati Rick has been taken to the hospital.
He was in the intensive care unit, but was recovering and taking visitors. The next day, while he was in his room by himself, a man came into the hospital dressed in a doctor's coat. He walked into Maserati Rick's room, blew his head off, and walked away quietly into the night, and that was the end of Maserati Rick.
That was kind of the zenith or nadir, however you want to look at it, of the violence in Detroit. There were no more off-limit zones. There was no sanctuary in the hospital. You would be killed anywhere.
An associate of Big Ed Hansard would be suspected of the crime, but never convicted.
Everybody in the city was upset. Rockin' Reg and them was upset too, you know?
The childhood friends, who had all grown up on the streets together to become rich beyond their wildest dreams, gathered together to put Maserati Rick into the ground. It was a funeral fit for a kingpin.
Maserati Rick was buried in a Mercedes-Benz coffin that cost $20,000. All the royalty of the drug underworld was there. I guess he went out in style.
Crying all outside the church, you know what I mean? It was just a painful moment for the whole city at that time. It was a big mourning because we lost a homie, you know?
Everybody was at his funeral because everybody was jockeying for a position. Guys that might be doing business together on Monday were at each other's throats on Tuesday.
Demetrius Meach Holloway, who had lost his partner and childhood friend, found himself in the hardest position.
Demetrius, without a question, knew that his life was in danger and wanted to go underground. It was a assault on all fronts. The riot was on the streets, and then the government was coming in with a full court press.
In those days, they were doing all the business over the phone, and it never dawned on them that the federal government would be listening to their conversations.
With national headlines in the wake of his partner's assassination, Holloway knew it was only a matter of time before federal agents focused their efforts on him.
He wanted to lay low, is what it seemed like to me, because it was getting pretty hot out here. A lot of people were getting killed.
November 1988. 4 masked men draw guns at the epicenter of East Side Detroit, the Top Hat hamburger stand.
Somebody fires some shots in the air, throws Demetrius Holloway in a trunk, and he disappears.
Next thing you know, I'm looking at the news and breaking story come on, you know? Meach got shot. I'm like, damn, you know what I mean? Not again.
The brazen public attack was only part of the surprise.
3 months later, I get a phone call in the office, but it sounds like Demetrius. He's dead. So I picked it up, I said, hello? He says, hey, it's the dead calling.
By 1989, Reggie Brown, the oldest living Brown brother at the time, was back on the streets of Detroit and playing the same game that had earned him his fierce reputation. Rockin' Reg was almost immediately implicated with the Best Friends gang in a triple homicide. It was a drive-by shooting in broad daylight. The target had been another member of the Best Friends gang, who had been arrested on a gun charge.
Reggie thought he was cooperating, so they wanted to eliminate him.
A little girl was one of the victims.
Police believe Reggie Brown shot up this East Side home on Buckingham Street. They say he killed 3-year-old Lori Roper, her uncle Harry Roper, cousin Chip Austin, and his friend Lawrence Gainey.
The Best Friends at this point were knocking each other off because they all knew they could put any of the other ones away for life. They had committed so many murders.
When you're dealing with these crews, you always got somebody out that crew, man, that's gonna turn on you, you know? And that's what really ate them inside and out, you know what I mean, when they people turned on them.
One of the first in the crew to come forward was Nate Boone Kraft. After his brother was killed, he blamed the Best Friends.
He had had a falling out with Rockin' Reg and Boogaloo and ended up turning against them.
Nate confessed to 30 murders, and not long after, the Best Friends were indicted. Nate Kraft went into witness protection.
One kingpin at war with the Best Friends, who everyone thought had disappeared, came out of hiding. The reports of Demetrius Holloway being kidnapped at gunpoint were all wrong.
He made it look like he was kidnapped and murdered. And about, I don't know, 3 months later, he was back in the streets.
Oh man, the kidnapping was just a hoax, you know what I mean? He wanted just to make people think, you know, he's got kidnapped, but all the time he wasn't. Meek was somewhat chilling, man, you know? And we all laughed about it, you know? All of us laughed about it when we heard that.
By all accounts, he should have stayed in the shadows. Less than a year after faking his own kidnapping, he was gone for good.
He was killed in a downtown men's clothing store, just like a block and a half away from the police headquarters.
It happened at the Broadway, a department store, in broad daylight.
The Broadway was kind of a stomping grounds of judges, lawyers, and big gangsters. Downtown Detroit was probably considered kind of a neutral zone because there's no real population down there. It's just shopping, and I guess Holloway felt comfortable.
Demetrius went with, I believe, a girlfriend of his to go buy clothes, specifically, I think, a pair of socks. He was at the counter, and a BMW pulls up to the front of the building.
The killer walked into the store, shot him multiple times, and then escaped.
Blows his head off, snaps his fingers, said, "That's done," and starts literally whistling Zippity-Doo-Dah as he walks out the door.
They killed Holloway, walked back outside, got their car and left. And they weren't caught for 15 years.
A Detroit thug named Les Milton was convicted of the shooting in 2005. His brother acted as the getaway driver, but their motive remains a mystery.
The Milton brothers ended up confessing to the murder of Demetrius Holloway, but they never, at least officially, told who gave them the order to do it.
Rumor has it that it came from the Brown brothers, but it's still a mystery. Demetrius Holloway's murder at the Broadway goes down in the Motor City as one of the most notorious gangland killings ever.
The Brown brothers, the founders of the Best Friends gang, had grown up with Holloway, worked with Holloway, and also warred with Holloway.
Brown brothers flee, and they're not seen of or heard of again in Detroit.
All these murders and this stuff happened in a pretty condensed 4 or 5 year period, but by the 90s, Best Friends had either killed everybody, chased them out of town, and a few other people were incarcerated or out of the game.
By 1992, federal authorities were still after the two surviving brothers, Rockin' Reg and Boogaloo.
The Best Friends indictment was huge. They had set up operations in New York, Philadelphia, Ohio, Virginia, Indiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, They were all over the place.
We were able to secure, I think it was first in the nation, roving wiretap authorization.
At the time, the technological advance allowed agents to track the Brown brothers' phones anywhere in the nation.
Reggie Brown was arrested on the streets of New York. Detroit police know Brown as Rockin' Reggie, and they've been looking for him for years.
They're eventually able to track the Brown brothers to New York, and they stage a sting at a Mercedes dealership in Manhattan.
Rockin' Reg was taken into custody. His brother Terrence hopped on a motorcycle, shot through Manhattan, and got away from the feds.
And in something that would seem like it would be out of a Denzel Washington movie or something, Boogaloo gets ahead of the motorcycle and goes on a high-speed chase that lasts hours around New York, eventually eluding authorities. And, you know, he gets away again.
They would find him 2 months later in Atlanta, wrapped in duct tape in the back of a pickup truck.
There was a crooked lawyer here in Detroit that put together $600,000 and sent it down to Atlanta so that Terrence Brown could do a major drug deal and reinvigorate the best friends.
He is found dead in an Atlanta hotel parking lot.
We had a surveillance video of the vehicle being dropped off and people getting out of the vehicle and departing the area.
Boogaloo, which was Terrence, had been killed supposedly by his own crew.
It was Charles Wilkes and Stacy Colbert. They decided to get rid of Boogaloo Brown because they were afraid that Boogaloo was going to kill them. So they killed him first.
The inner circle of the best friends decided that Terrence Brown had to go.
Every group ends the same way. Very few of them fade into the woodwork. Very few people go into retirement and go live in a nursing home. It ends the same way for every drug group. Eventually, the feds get them.
While there was only one Brown brother left standing, the federal government took down everyone related to the best friends.
All told, we prosecuted approximately 60 individuals. Those are the people that were still alive because a number of them were killed before they were charged.
I read an FBI report on the best friends, and it characterized them as the most murderous black gang in United States history. During their case, there was dozens and dozens and dozens of homicides brought up. One of the lawyers described it to me that there were so many murders they couldn't remember. You know, did I kill that guy on Thursday and we killed this other guy on Friday? Oh, no, that wasn't Steve we killed that day. That was Joe we killed that day. They talked about murder like a dog walking into the street and getting hit by a car. It just didn't mean anything.
I grew up here in Detroit, Michigan, on the east side. When I was 9 years old, my stepfather got murdered in front of me and my mother. From that point, I got involved with gangs, drugs, and violence by the time I was 10 years old. I eventually left Detroit in '89, for good, never to return. I wanted to better my life, and I wanted to show my mother that I could do more than just sell drugs and gangbang. So that was the turning point in my life when Demetrius and Rick got killed. Because at the end of the day, it's a penitentiary or the graveyard, man, so you have to make a choice.
What's kind of sad, amongst many other sad things, is that for all these hundreds and hundreds and millions of dollars that were generated in the streets of Detroit, one look around Detroit will show you that it's all gone. Legacy of the Best Friends gang is death and destruction. It's just a legacy of sadness, just like the whole city of Detroit itself.